In many ways, this feels like a dark hour in the life of our world. There are things to celebrate, don't get me wrong, in modern life, but there's a certain darkness in our world today. And peace sounds like it may be coming in Ukraine, but at what cost? The world order seems to be shifting a little bit. Values like respect, decency, and compassion don't feel like they could be taken for granted in the Western world anymore. And that's before we mention countless conflicts around the world that barely make our headlines. We have a growing mental health crisis here in the UK. More and more people out of work. Our health service is buckling under its own weight. We don't seem to be any closer to solutions on what to do with our national debt, what to do about the refugee crisis, though we've changed governments. And the birth rate is falling and falling. It's the lowest it's ever been in the UK. And the sort of tech empires, artificial intelligence, are marching ever forwards unchecked. And it can feel like a dark hour in the life of our world. And as we were reflecting with the children, all of us have gone through dark hours in our personal lives at one point or another. Diagnoses that got worse and not better. Wandering children walking further and further away. Careers that we failed in. Relationships that have broken down. Passions that failed to provide the hope, excitement, and purpose that they promised. We know what it's like to live in a dark hour. And it is a dark hour that we reach in Luke chapter 22, verses 39 to 62. Jesus and his friends have headed out to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark and Matthew tell us, as they always did. And they've gone there once more after their last Passover meal together. And it's an hour in which darkness reigned. We've taken that as the title for this sermon series, When Darkness Reigned, because it's the final thing that Jesus says in verse 53 before he's arrested, before the will of all his warnings about the cross became a was. Jesus was, in these verses, handed over into the hands of evil men. Jesus was delivered to his enemies. Jesus was betrayed by one of his own, just as he'd warned in chapter 9, verse 44, in chapter 18, verse 32, and last week in chapter 22, verse 21. These things in this passage become no longer future things, predictions, prophecies, but realities, things that happened to Jesus in this dark, dark hour, lighter only perhaps than the hour Luke will record in chapter 23, verse 44, when the Father will bring physical darkness down on the land to match the spiritual darkness of his created beings putting to death the one through whom they were made. So let's walk through the passage together now, and then we'll consider what it means for us today. And the first thing we see here is that Jesus was delivered by one of his own. In verses 39 to 53, Jesus was delivered by one of his own. Because in this familiar place, at this familiar time of day, on this seemingly ordinary night, a group of dim figures appear through the shade of the trees as Jesus prays and his disciples snooze. And Luke singles out one man as he introduces the crowd to us, the man leading them to Jesus. And note how Luke first distances us from him, the man who was called Judas, as if they didn't even know him. And then Luke sticks in the knife, revealing this was no stranger at all. This was one of the 12, in verse 47. Imagine the shock as Judas, one of them, one of Jesus' closest friends and followers, one who'd been with Jesus through thick and thin from the beginning, leading Jesus' enemies towards them in their private, their special place. And remember, Judas wasn't an obvious villain, and the disciples had had no idea which of them would betray Jesus when Jesus had revealed this shocking fact to them a few verses earlier. They hadn't all been nodding to each other, that'll be Judas. Of course, it'll be Judas. They'd had no idea which of them could do such a thing. Why did Judas do this? Well, we're not told. John is the only gospel writer who gives any hint that Judas was anything other than a model disciple. In John chapter 12, we learn that Judas was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So there was a strain of selfishness in Judas, maybe a worldliness, a willingness and ability to deceive that he'd already been nurturing before this opportunity to hand Jesus over arose. And all the disciples had been a bit confused about Jesus. He wasn't the sort of Messiah they'd been expecting, that they thought the scriptures had promised them. Maybe the most profit Judas thought he could get from Jesus was the pile of silver the Jewish leaders, desperate to get their hands on Jesus, needing an insider's help to lead them to him, was able to get. But that's speculation. Back to the story. Judas had planned to plant a kiss on Jesus' cheek to identify the rabbi to the armed crowd on this dark night. But before he can get there, Jesus calls out his hypocrisy in verse 48. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Is this really how you're going to do it, Judas, with this sign of love and affection and intimacy? Luke doesn't tell us whether Judas went ahead and kissed Jesus. Maybe he didn't need to. For with these words, hasn't Jesus identified himself? No one else called him the Son of Man. It was the name he used for himself. Here he is, says Jesus, and Judas's work is done. He's done what he's been paid to do. He's delivered Jesus to his enemies like a lamb to the slaughter. Jesus has been delivered over by one of his own. What treachery. And then there's this scene in which Jesus' disciples think that what Jesus needs from them isn't to stand with him, but to spring to his defense. And one of them slices the ear of one of his attackers. If only they'd prayed with the vigor that disciple used his sword. But Luke then turns his spotlight onto the crowd in verse 52. A crowd who, it turns out, are the establishment themselves, the priests, the officers, the elders. I'm sure there are a fair few servants in the mix, maybe some hired thugs to build up the numbers. But this is the religious, the military, and the civic leaders of the Jewish people. And Jesus turns his irony now onto them. Am I leading a rebellion? He asks, that you've come with swords and clubs. Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. Am I a bandit that you've come to get me like this? He asked them, using the same word for rebellion that he used to describe the robbers in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the men who beat up that man and left him for dead. Really? All these weapons? What weapon have you ever seen me use? And why come by night, when any day you could have taken me in the temple? This death sentence will be a sham from the word go before the trial has happened, before the arrest has even happened. Such cowardice, such hypocrisy. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. Jesus concludes. He knows that the Father has given this time over to Satan, to the spiritual forces of evil, to the wicked people who want Jesus dead. He knows that evil will rule in this hour, and good will not intervene to stop it. And so he is delivered into his enemy's hands by one of his own, and into the hands of his own, into the hands of God's own people. What betrayal. First, we see Judas. Second, we see that Jesus was disowned by his right-hand man. Jesus was disowned by his right-hand man. From verse 54 down to 62. Because Judas wasn't the only disciple to let Jesus down in this dark hour. The crowd seize Jesus and lead him away, not responding to his words with anything other than that action in verse 54. But Luke doesn't take us with Jesus into the house of the high priest for the beginning of Jesus' trial. Instead, we follow Peter to a fire in the courtyard of the high priest's house. Perhaps we feel a little nervous for Peter, taking a seat on his own among those who've just arrested Jesus. But this is Jesus' right-hand man. This is Peter, who is ready to go with you to prison and to death, as he'd said at the meal just a few hours earlier. If anyone could stand strong here, it would be ready for anything. Let me at him, Peter. Well, as the kindling crackles, the fire burns, one servant girl's attention is drawn to a stranger sitting among them. She looked closely at Peter and said, "This man was with him." Maybe she'd been in the crowd who'd arrested Jesus. Maybe she'd just recognized Peter from being by Jesus' side day after day in the temple over that past week. Or maybe she knew that a northern Galilean man would not be likely to be in the temple here in the south at night unless he were linked to this northern rabbi, Jesus. What does ready for anything, let me at him, right-hand man Peter say in response to her challenge? Woman, I don't know him. I've never met this man. I've got nothing to do with him. He's nothing to do with me. What? How could Peter say that? We're appalled. Though which of us can throw the first stone? Which of us hasn't, in private, spoken bold words of what we'll do, what we'll say, how we'll be, only to squirm, to stay silent, to back away when we feel the pressure of the moment? And Peter must have been terrified by what was happening to Jesus, and terrified at the thought of what might happen to him and anyone associated with Jesus. But nevertheless, it was terrible what Peter did here. It was a cruel denial of having anything to do with his Lord. It wasn't keeping quiet when there had been an opportunity to speak up. It wasn't talking about church when we could have talked about Jesus. It wasn't admitting that Jesus was a good teacher, but not confessing him as Saviour and Lord. It was a cruel denial of having anything to do with Jesus. Just a few hours earlier, Peter wouldn't have thought himself capable of such a thing. And slipping up once, we might have let go as a mistake. But a second time, I'm not one of them. Verse 58. A third time, man, I don't even know what you're talking about. In verse 60. It's a pattern. Peter doesn't know Jesus. He isn't one of Jesus' men. He doesn't even know what they're talking about, apparently. Ready for anything, right-hand man Peter disowns Jesus. His lies getting bolder and bigger and brasher with each new set of eyes around that fire pit that falls on him until a cockerel crows and a final set of eyes fall upon him. The Lord, presumably passing through the courtyard at this moment, turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And now there's only one look that matters to Peter, the look of Jesus. And it all comes flooding back, his brash overconfidence and his Lord's solemn glimpse into the future. And overcome by shame, Peter went outside and wept bitterly. And that's how we leave him. We don't see much more of Peter in Luke's Gospel. We don't see him at all during chapter 23. We see him just briefly in chapter 24, investigating the empty tomb. But we don't need to see Peter again, because we know that this won't be the end of his story. Jesus had prayed for him, remember? And Jesus had promised that Peter would turn back, that he'd repent, that he'd be restored. And I wonder what that look from Jesus must have contained. Hurt, pain, conviction, sure, but also compassion, love, promise, hope. Peter may not have known how badly he could fail, but Jesus knew, and Jesus had prayed for him. And it won't be until the book of Acts, which is kind of like Luke Part 2, or it's also written by Luke, that we'll see repentant Peter restored and serving his Lord again. But for now, we're left with broken Peter on his own. Jesus was disowned by his right-hand man. And in fact, all of his disciples, maybe the others not quite as boldly and publicly as Peter does here, but they'd all let their Lord down, whether sleeping in the garden when they could have been praying, maybe trying to fight when Jesus needed them to stand with him. And where are they now? It's only Peter, and we know from John's Gospel, John, that seem to have followed Jesus to the high priest's house. Jesus has been left alone to face his darkest hour. But he's not entirely alone. For there's one more person to consider. Our third point and final point. Jesus was drinking his Father's cup. From verses 41 to 44. Because the biggest tragedy, the biggest shock of this dark scene isn't that Jesus was abandoned or betrayed by human beings. He could have coped with being on his own, with being betrayed, with being disowned. The biggest shock is not to do with Judas or Peter or even Satan, but to do with God, the Father. Look down, let's read those verses again from verse 41 to 44. Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. What's worse for Jesus than a friend's betrayal, than Satan's sifting? Well, it's drinking the Father's cup. Not a real physical cup, but a metaphor. And the prophets in the Old Testament had spoken many times of how God was preparing a cup for his enemies to drink, a bitter cup that would make them reel and stagger as they drank the wine of God's good, right, and holy judgment against their sin. That's Psalm 75, verse 8. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine, mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs. Or Isaiah 51, verse 17. Rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath. You have drained it to its dregs, the goblet that makes people stagger. At the cross, Jesus was going to drink this cup. He was going to down it, empty it. Every single sip of God's good, holy, right, burning anger against the wickedness and sin of his people was going to pour down Jesus' throat. This was what Jesus dreaded at the cross. It wasn't thoughts of his friends betraying, disowning, abandoning him. It wasn't the thoughts of the lies of the priests or the lashes of the soldiers or the heckling of the spectators or the pain of having nails through his wrists that had him in anguish, begging That there might be another way, sweating so profusely that perspiration poured off him like blood. It was drinking his Father's cup, the cup of God's wrath, that led to this anguish. We see here in this precious scene how hard Jesus, in his human nature, found going to the cross. We see what the cross would cost him. We see his deep anguish as he faced his imminent future. Jesus did not find it easy to die on the cross for you and me. In his human nature, he found it excruciatingly hard. It was the most difficult thing a human being has ever done. Far greater than the emotional, the physical, the mental pain was this spiritual cost, drinking his Father's anger against his people's sin. But is our sin really that bad? Perhaps we're thinking. We're basically good on the inside, aren't we? Well, we're made in God's image, and God has given us his common grace. We are not as bad as we could be. But we don't have to spend too long looking inside, looking at the thoughts, the feelings, the urgings of our heart, looking at the world around us, thinking through history, recent history, the world today, to see just how much sin there is in the human race, and to see just how awful our sin is. We're fallen people, living in a fallen world, and if there was any other way God could fix it without sending his Son to die, surely he would have. Just consider for a moment how you'd feel if your every thought, your every feeling was proclaimed for everyone to see. How desperate you would be for the ground to swallow you up as those angry thoughts, those mean thoughts, those selfish feelings were revealed before everyone. I think the sentencing alone for my sin, just the reading out of my sins, would take a lifetime. And that's before any punishment began. And then multiply that by every Christian who's ever lived. And it was the anger, it was what was owed for that Jesus was bearing on the cross. That's why he asked if his Father might take the cup away if there was any other way. It was an awful cup to drink. But how could the Father subject his Son to this? Cosmic child abuse is what some have called this. What kind of parent would force their child to face a punishment like this for something they haven't even done wrong? But Jesus was willing. We see how hard it was in these verses, but we also see how willing he was. Because he begins his prayer in request. Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. But he ends it in submission. Yet not my will, but yours be done. And this wasn't the Father sort of twisting his Son's arm, applying emotional pressure to do this 11th hour rescue attempt he'd come up with. No, this was what the Father, Son, and Spirit had planned since before creation began. This was Jesus, the Son's plan, as well as the Father's and the Spirit's, and he was willing to do it. He wanted to do it. He prayed, yet not my will, but yours be done. And Jesus was not alone in this moment. After having recommitted himself to their plan, his Father sent down an angel who strengthened him. No other gospel writer mentions that little detail. The Father was with Jesus in this moment, not taking away the pain and the anguish. The sweat like drops of blood comes in the next verse after the angel's visit, or while the angel is still there. But his Father is with him, comforting him, strengthening him, giving him what he needed to go through with this. Here in this dark hour is the Son of God on his own, before his heavenly Father, preparing to drink the cup of his Father's anger against sin. What does it mean for us? What are we to do with it? Or two reflections this morning. The first, we're to stand with Jesus. In some Bible passages, the human men and women in them give us examples to follow. We're to be brave like Esther before King Xerxes, or brave like Daniel in the lion's den. Here, that is very much not the case. We are not to follow the examples of any of the human beings in this passage. For there will be times, like Judas, that will be tempted to walk away from the faith, to give up on Jesus for good. Church hasn't come good for us. Jesus hasn't given us what we wanted, what we thought he'd promised. Others around us seem to be turning away. And whether in a sudden moment of betrayal or more likely through the small step by step down a slippery slope, we'll be tempted to walk away from Jesus, to give up on him and his promises. Don't do it. Luke warns us here. God warns us here. Judas sold his soul for 30 pieces of silver. And in Matthew's gospel we read that just a few hours later, he went and hung himself. Almost immediately, Judas realized that it wasn't worth it, that he wasn't going to find what he was looking for somewhere other than Jesus. He went away empty, devastated, and very soon dead. Don't follow his example. Don't walk away from Jesus. And don't copy Peter's example here either, because we too live in a world that is hostile to Jesus and will sometimes be hostile towards us for being his followers. Now, I don't think this means that we've got to force opportunities to speak of Jesus where there aren't any, that we're to beat people over the head with our Bibles, that we're to feel guilty if we ever speak of anything other than Jesus to our unbelieving family members and friends. But I think it is telling us that we will sometimes find ourselves under the spotlight, under pressure to play down or even deny our faith, to not say who Jesus is and that we follow him and why. Let's not be like Peter, left weeping bitterly as he let his Lord down. Let's not fear what people think of us, but let's be motivated by love for people and love for Jesus, not fear of what they'll make of us and embarrassment of Jesus. Let's pray for the boldness of Peter in Acts to take away the fear of Peter in Luke 22. And let's know that when we do let Jesus down, when we do fail, we can come back to him. For Jesus had prayed for Peter. Peter would turn back, and Jesus prays for us. So when we fail, we can come back to him. We can admit our failure, and we can let his look fall upon us, his look that might bring hurt and pain and conviction of sin, but his look too that brings love and compassion and the promise of forgiveness. How much sweeter that forgiveness tastes when we realize, like Peter, how we failed. So the first application is to stand with Jesus. But the second, and I think the bigger one, sticking with my S theme, is to swig from his cup. Because this isn't the first cup that we've seen in Luke chapter 22. Jesus would take a cup, but he also gave a cup. As we saw last week, as we read again earlier, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Take it and divide it among you. Drink from it. Jesus took this cup so he could give his followers a cup to drink. So drink from it and swig from it. Don't just sip a little because you're strong like Peter. You would never betray Jesus. You would never deny him. You would never let him down. You only need a little bit of his grace to add to your strength. Don't do that. swig from it. Drink it all. Drink as much of God's grace as you can. Lap up his forgiveness, his strength, his nourishment, his spirit at work for and in you. We need every bit of his grace that he'll give us. We too are prone to fail and to fall. We do not know how much our sin cost Jesus, and yet he freely and abundantly poured out his blood for us. So drink from his cup, swig from it. Drink it literally as we share communion. Make it your commitment to be here in our church services as often as you can, to share the cup with your brothers and sisters. And drink it metaphorically as you pray, as you receive, as you enjoy what Christ has done for you, as you bask in the knowledge that Jesus knows how you failed him. He knows how you will fail him, but you will never be punished because Jesus has paid it all. He's downed God's cup for you so that you can swig freely from the cup of his grace.